Yeah, well, I grew up in like the southern suburbs, so and that's where the band I was in, Terrible Virtue, kind of formed, Carrying Bar, and probably the first. I remember our first gig was in Newtown, so that was kind of the big deal, playing in Newtown. I think the first gig was that we played with me and the band. There was a lineup before that played like a couple of parties. That was like late '88. It was at Newtown Neighbourhood Centre. Oh no, sorry, Berlin Hall, Berlin Community Centre, wasn't it? Yeah, at Newtown. That was the first gig we played, like late '88, and that was like, I remember that because I remember the lineup. I'm pretty sure it was like SSDC from Canberra, Insight from Melbourne, and I think it was Lethal Overdose or LOD. So, and like we were on first and stuff, and it was like Brett from Radio Skid Row used to do a punk show, put the gig on. He used to put gigs on there, and they were usually a benefit for Skid Row, I think. So yeah, but that was like a big deal for us playing there. And from there, I guess Newtown at that time, I wasn't living at Newtown at that time, but like Newtown at that time, it was different to now. I mean, that place is even there now, and it was like, I guess it was, full of like, it was either, migrant families living there, or punks or students, or, people could live there pretty cheaply. It wasn't like the place it is now, where it was really kind of expensive and everyone wanted to live there. Wasn't. Yeah, so that was pretty much, it was very different to now. So Terrible Virtue, then we played, like that first gig, and then from after that we kind of went on and we played with like the bands that were around at the time, like, Rocks, because, it was a band we used to go and see, and I think, I remember playing with them at like, probably at Sutherland Royal or something like that, and we did some gigs at Penshurst Den as well, because, because we were down that way, that was kind of where we played, but we also did play in the city, and because I remember playing the Journos Club too, and Vicious Circle came up one time and played a couple of nights at the Journos in the city. That was like, near Central Station. It's not there anymore, but yeah, we played there. One of those gigs I remember playing, one of those 2 nights we played. So we did play in the city a little bit at that point, and then I don't think who else we played with. Oh, then I guess Mass Appeal as well. I remember playing with them at Sutherland Royal. Don't think we ever played with the Hard-Ons, but early on, they were some of the bands that I first saw were like bands like Mass Appeal and the Hard-Ons, and there's a few others as well. But yeah, Rocks, I mentioned them already, but they were probably the earliest bands I saw, around that time, that sort of got me into things.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I guess another venue to mention that I kind of saw some first gigs at for myself was like St James Tavern, which was like in the city, and that was like at least have like a Wednesday night, I think it was, and then it was like, so bands used to play there, and I'm pretty sure, I would have seen Mass Appeal play there, and other bands came up, even like, I think Festa Fanatics and Venom P. Stinger from Melbourne, and all sorts of bands played there, and that was like this Wednesday night thing, that went for a little while, but it was just something, I remember going there, and I didn't live in the city at that point or anything, but it was just, it was on, it was somewhere you knew you could go and see sort of punk kind of bands, on a Wednesday night. So, Persecution was a band that was already going before I joined it. I joined it in '91. I think at that point, Terrible Virtue had broken up for the first time, and so like the guys from Persecution had seen me in Terrible Virtue, and so they asked me if I wanted to come and try it on vocals, and then then I ended up in the band, and I'm pretty sure it was '91, and then we started playing around with that lineup. I guess that band was kind of more, like a bit of a crossover thing, where it kind of mixed sort of more crusty stuff with metal, with punk, with grind, So it had that sort of crossover appeal, where some metalheads liked us, and some punks liked us, and some of the crusties liked us, because there was a bit of a mix going on there, and and earlier on the band used to play like some covers, like they used to do like an Extreme Noise Terror cover and some Napalm Death songs and stuff like that. So there was that kind of crossover there. And I think even like before I joined the band, I remember seeing them supporting like Tutor Partsy and things like that. So they were kind of around before that, and I remember seeing them play at Berlin Hall, like in Newtown. I think I remember them playing like first on at a gig that Terrible Virtue played, so it was that kind of thing, So, and back then I remember they were doing like remember hearing them do it like a Pistols cover and stuff like that. So they kind of changed later on. It was like doing, you know, Napalm Death covers. But you know, Deathstorm was a thing that I started putting on some gigs. Based, like, it was basically based around Persecution, so it was a way of putting on gigs for the band, but then putting together a bigger lineup and putting on shows. And so like the shows initially were at the Newtown Neighbourhood Centre, and you know, it was kind of like, this would have been like early 90s into maybe mid 90s at the latest that I did them for. But they kind of like I mean, that hall then you could just hire it out and just do your own thing, and you know, it was all ages, but it was pretty loose, you know. So yeah, it was good. So a lot of, you know, but yeah, you probably couldn't get away with that now, you know. And eventually I had to stop doing them because they just they didn't want people doing that kind of stuff there anymore, basically. So that's probably the only reason I really stopped doing stuff there. But yeah, I mean, shows had been done since there, but it's just kind of, yeah, I think you just couldn't do that there now, you know. It just wouldn't happen, you know. So but yeah, we had some pretty good shows, yeah, you know, a couple of hundred kids turning up, and you know, usually a bit of a mix of, you know, sort of, you know, pretty extreme metal kind of bands, you know, playing sort of, you know, like, you know, sort of death grind kind of stuff, but then you had, you know, had some hardcore and punk bands in there as well. So it was a bit of a mix of stuff. We did some shows. I think we might have done one at the Lewisham under that name possibly, and did one at the Vic on the Park, I remember. Yeah, and Lewisham was another place that used to play with Persecution, and some punk bands played there, but it was kind of a bit more known as a metal sort of place, I guess, because the guy booked it. Brad Sims used to run a metal store out of Parramatta, and he kind of was always like just booking gigs there every weekend pretty much. So it was kind of like a consistent thing. You could play gigs there, and but yeah, there was a bit of a crossover there, you know. So yeah, I guess even one of the guys, I remember one of the guys from Subliminal Pressure used to do the sound there, the singer, who's now dead. I'm trying to remember his name, but
Cameron.
Yeah, but yeah. So I mean, there was that kind of thing. I remember seeing Two Departs play there one time as well in '92. I think I remember seeing them play at Lewisham. So there was a bit of crossover there. As far as fanzines go, me and the guitarist from Terrible Virtue, Richard, we did one issue of a fanzine, and then it had the worst name ever. It was like Dog Lickers from Hell Visit the Leper Colony. Don't ask me why. Anyway, I guess it was funny at the time. But but yeah, and then we started on a second issue, and it never got off the ground. It was kind of like, you know, it was in process, but it never actually got out there. But the first one got out there, and we just kind of photocopied it. We had some free deal where we could photocopy it at some sort of thing at Sutherland. There was like this youth kind of, there was one of those things for, you know, youth who were on the dole and that. And we weren't actually on the dole ring. I think we were still at school then, but it was like we could just access this place that would let us go and use their photocopier, you know, and they thought it was a good thing. So, oh yeah, go and, you know, be creative kids, do something. So we kind of photocopied this fanzine and kind of got it out there. But it was just basically featured all the bands we liked at the time. You know, it had like Lethal Overdose in it, and like Mass Appeal, and I think it had like My Heart Bleeds For You, and interviews with the bands at the time, you know, and photos that I'd taken, and you know, rants that, you know, that Richard had written, and some of his artwork and stuff, and he kind of laid it all out and put it all together. So yeah, you know, just a real cut and paste kind of thing. So I guess as soon as I started going to punk gigs and that, I started taking photos really, like with a shitty little camera that I, you know, borrowed from my parents, you know, like a little Instamatic film camera. But and then eventually I bought a half decent camera, just a second-hand film camera, like an SLR off a mate, and just started using that, shooting film. But yeah, I guess I was already into kind of photography. I was already sort of dabbling in it, and then I guess taking photos of bands was something that was exciting, you know, and it made me want to take photos. You know, there wasn't that much else I was really that into taking photos of. So, but every time, you know, there was a gig on that I was going to, I'd just take my camera with me, and there wasn't that many people taking photos at that time either. So it was kind of like, you kind of felt like, fuck, you know, some of these bands, you know, someone should take photos of them, you know, because otherwise there'll be no record of them, of some of them, at least as far as photos go and stuff, because, you know, there just wasn't that much out there, you know. Not like now where there's a million people with digital cameras and everything's getting covered, and which is a good, not a bad thing. Like, I mean, everything that happens now is probably, there's a photograph of it, you know, but yeah, then there was just like, it's kind of probably pretty limited the number of photos you're going to find of a lot of these bands, you know. So yeah, because I guess at the time it seemed like things were really extreme as far as like things were really in the punk scene. It seemed like things were really either really left wing or really right wing, and I guess you call it the punk scene because, you know, there was Nazi skinheads hanging around, going to the gigs for whatever reason, you know, the extreme right. But then most of the punks were pretty left, and especially a little bit later on with sort of bands like To the Partsy and that, and the sort of crust kind of scene that was, you know, really left. And so there was of course there was going to be this big clash, but so there was, you know, there was some violence because of that, you know, but it feels like now compared to them, things are more moderate, you know, where there's people are less kind of ultra PC and left, but then if people are on the right, it's not really that out there anymore. It's not as in your face. So I don't know. It's kind of like everything's shifted to the center a bit more now. Which is I don't know, good and bad. Like it's probably maybe things are just, you know, everyone's sitting on the fence a bit more now, possibly, but back then it was probably too far the other way, where there was just, you know, people getting bashed by Nazi skinheads, and that kind of stuff happened pretty regularly, you know. And yeah, that was the ugly side of the scene, you know. That was the downside to it, and that was what, you know, you'd go to gigs when you're just a young kid, you know, and you're kind of, you know, there was you were scared that, you know, something might happen, you know, like you'd go anyway because, you know, you wanted to see the bands and you were into it, but you knew there was a chance that you know, if you didn't get hassled, you might get bashed, you know, or, you know, you'd at least be intimidated at some point, you know, like some big gnarly skinhead would be like, you'd be like, oh shit, what's going to happen, you know, and you just want to watch the bands, you know, you don't really want any trouble. But that was definitely part of it, you know. Then it's like, I remember one time being at the Palace in Darlinghurst, which I think is now the Pump House. Anyway, I remember, I'm pretty sure it was My Heart Bleeds you were playing there, and some other bands, and then all these skinheads turned up, and I don't know what the deal was, but anyway, I remember some of them trying to make them play whatever songs they wanted to hear, basically threatening them, you know, play this song or else, you know. And so, and then the irony was, I remember this skinhead guy making them play United Forces, which the irony is that the lyrics are like, you know, it doesn't matter how you wear your hair, it's what's inside your head. Anyway, whatever. And United Forces, anyway, whatever. I think the irony was lost. But yeah, it was. But then it wasn't really that funny because things escalated pretty quickly. And I remember some skinhead girl glassing this punk girl, throwing a schooner at her head, and she was pissing blood. And then I remember like this guy Barry, who was around, who ended up singing for a band called Deviant Kickback. Him and I think this other guy, I think probably Troy Brown was there, I think. I just remember seeing him driving past the pub in his mum's little like Corolla or something, with all these skinheads jumping on the roof and trying to rip the doors off the thing as they were trying to drive away. And it was just like, and then that was, I can't remember who I was with, but we were like, I think it's time to go, you know. It's like, you know, things are getting fucking ugly. And like, you know, shit like that didn't happen all the time, but it happened enough that you're like, fuck, you know, this shit can happen anytime. Any gig you go to can just get out of control, you know, and just like get real ugly. So, and even later on, and this was probably would have been late 80s, but even later on, stuff like that continued to happen, you know. Like I remember seeing Subversion play at like Vic on the Park, and like, you know, some skinheads jumping up on stage and starting to smash their gear up and starting to punch the band, and then like it it stopped, you know. It didn't go on for that long, but you know, stuff like that happened, you know, because I mean they were a target because they had a song that was like an anti-Nazi song, and you know, I think it might have been when they were playing that song that they thought, oh, this is the cue for us to jump up and smash these punks, and you know, so that stuff was happening, and that was probably, I don't know, I guess that was getting into the you know 92 onwards kind of time, you know, or maybe it was even into the mid 90s. I can't remember the exact year, but you know, so it continued on for a while, that stuff. But also remember that at some point, like some of the punks and that, and the crusty punks and some of the punks around at the time kind of started fighting back, and that's kind of, as far as I could see, seemed to be what sort of stopped a lot of it, you know, which is, it's kind of fucked up that it took violence to stop the violence, but but it seemed to be what happened, you know, like, because people were getting bashed and all sorts of shit was happening, and people would get ganged up on if they were caught on their own, or just with a couple of punks on their own, and then, you know, a bunch of skinheads found them, you know, they were fucked, you know, so they started turning the tables and doing the same thing to them, which kind of seemed to stop things, you know, which is sad but true. There wasn't just violence from you know, involving punks and skinheads. There was also, you know, there was violence coming from you know, with cops, you know, and like, so, and that's pretty different to now. It's not something you'd probably expect to see now, you know. It could still happen, but it's, you know, it's something that would happen back then. Where, like, I can remember one time being on Sutherland Station, like after a gig there, you know, and after a gig at Sutherland Royal, and like, you know, all these cops turning up, and everyone was just trying to get home, you know, back to the city or wherever they live from after the gig. So I guess there was just a bunch of punks on the train station, you know, at night, and so, you know, of course that, you know, drew attention. You know, they drew attention to themselves. The cops somehow, you know, would have heard about it or noticed or whatever. Anyway, so they turned up, and I remember there was a bit of confrontation, and I remember one guy I know, like, ended up punching a cop, and, you know, stuff like that. You just couldn't imagine that really sort of happening now, but yeah, that really fucking got out of control, and things like that did happen sometimes. You know, there was that kind of confrontation, you know, like even like a venue that was going for a while in Chippendale, like Jellyheads, you know, I remember cops turning up there and trying to shut gigs down there, and then people grabbing cops' hats and all sorts of shit happening and just like harassing them and just like turning into a real confrontation, you know, stuff like that would happen. And even like, I can remember like one of the first early punks picnics, there was like some of the early punks picnics that happened in Sydney were like in the late 80s. There was like, the first ones didn't even have bands, like, and I think the first one that I know of was in like, would have been in Victoria Park near the Lansdowne, and like it was just a bunch of punks and skinheads and stuff just hanging out, just drinking, you know. And then there was some later ones after that were in the Domain in Hyde Park, and there was one I didn't go to, and I remember there was even an article in the Daily Telly or something, you know, after that, because there was like there was basically cops turned up on horses and tried to move people along, you know, because they were just hanging out in the park just drinking. There was no bands or anything, and and people ended up getting chased by the cops. I remember a bloke I was living with got like done for resisting arrest, but a resisting arrest involved like being, you know, chased by a cop on a horseback while he's hitting you with a baton. That's resisting arrest. So there's shit like that happened, and I remember there was an article, yeah, like I said, you know, a few days later, or next day or whatever, there was an article in the telly saying, you know, punks in the park or whatever, you know, and it was some sort of painted as some sort of, you know, violent punks, you know, doing whatever. It was just like, it was more like fucking cops, you know, harassing punks, but because, you know, yeah. But then after that, you know, things started happening at the punks picnics at Sydney Park down at St Peter's, and, you know, they went on for years without sort of too much harassment, and bands were playing, and, you know, bands like To The Party and that were playing those, and, you know, I don't remember those being broken up by the cops. So for some reason that area seemed to be able to tolerate it down there, you know, even though the cops would sometimes turn up and just have a look, but generally I don't remember them ever being sort of shut down or anything, you know. It was like, it's ironic that I've heard more recently that there were some picnics that happened there for a little while later on that have been shut down, you know, because I guess it's because the area has changed so much, you know. It's more gentrified now, and there's more families living around there, and there's all those new, you know, apartments built near there, and there's, you know, kids with their families and all that, sort of hanging out in that park now. It's more of a family-friendly park, so I guess, you know, it's probably not really, it's funny that now it's probably less tolerated than it was. Some of the bands that I thought were important to me at least, were like, I guess just starting with like the Hard-Ons were one of the first bands I saw, so they were kind of important to me, you know, and probably one of their, you know, like Smell My Finger was probably one of the first sort of punk records I bought, you know, so I guess they were a really good introduction to like, well, here's a local band, you know, I can go and see them, and, you know, I can buy their record, you know, sort of thing. They were, you know, and then that probably led me to stuff like Mass Appeal as well, you know, buying their first record and stuff like that, and, you know, and they were like, that first record is still such a great record, you know, it's a real, you know, seminal hardcore record, you know, not just for Sydney or Australia, for the world really, for 86, you know, it's a pretty amazing record. And, you know, and to see them at that point, like, I didn't see them that early, you know, 86, but to see them like 88, you know, they were pretty intense bands, you know, like, you know, and it was a big change from what was around in Sydney before that, from what I can gather, just from, you know, listening to the records that came out before that. They kind of marked a bit of a shift to like playing more fast, intense, kind of American influenced kind of, you know, hardcore punk, you know, whereas before that, you know, if you listen to the records or the bands that were around, it was more, you know, sort of English influenced. It was more kind of still coming from more of a 70s kind of punk thing, you know. They marked more that transition to like there being sort of more of a hardcore influence, American 80s hardcore influence on the music, you know. So yeah, so I think they were really important in that respect. And then I guess there was other bands at the time that were kind of that my band Terrible Virtue were playing with, like Lethal Overdose. I thought were important. I was just kind of doing more of a, you know, sort of, you know, a hardcore, fast hardcore punk with a bit of a metal influence in there. You know, there's a little bit touching on the crossover kind of thing that was starting to come through in the late 80s. Who else? I'm just trying to think. I guess like SUX when they come along, like they were, you know, playing really fast, you know. I guess I think that first record they put out was about 1990, I think. But, you know, thought they were like a really cool band at the time, you know. And, you know, and Lyle and Alan were both Indian, and that was kind of unusual for the time, you know. Like, you know, it was still a very, you know, mostly white scene, you know what I mean? Like it was mostly young white guys, you know. So any kind of diversity was a good thing, you know. So, and I'm just trying to think, and then I guess 1990 you had To Departsy around then, or probably a bit earlier I guess they started, but you know, they were a pretty important band, and they sort of, the whole crust scene that kind of was built around them. There was other bands that kind of came out of that scene, you know, Deviant Kickback and a few other bands that kind of came out of that scene around that time, but you know, they were really important, and like they were pretty popular at the time in that scene. Just trying to think who else was there that was important. I know there's a couple I was forgetting about. I guess yeah, like UTI, Under the Influence, like, you know, I used to go and see them a bit. I used to, you know, like those guys. They were pretty cool, and obviously they, you know, with Scott McFadden being in, you know, the singer in that band, led into Toe to Toe later on. But yeah, they were a good band at the time. And then obviously Toe to Toe, you know, 92, that kind of changed things, with them sort of bringing, you know, more of a sort of, you know, hardcore sound into things. And my band at the time, Terrible Virtue, like we'd reformed again after breaking up the first time, and we did their first tour that they did. We played with them, like I think it was like Sydney, Canberra, can't remember where else. There was a few gigs anyway. It was a run of gigs, and there was another band on the bill, Hybrid, who was like ex kind of Lethal Overdose guys. So it was kind of like, I guess it was kind of continuing on from that, you know, what had been happening in the late 80s into that. But it was a new thing, you know, and Toe to Toe became the new thing, you know, because yeah, they were a great band, you know. It was, yeah, that was an exciting time. And I guess after that, you know, there was bands like Subversion that were, you know, I thought were pretty important bands. That, you know, they were guys from the Northern Beaches, but, you know, and then there always been guys from the Northern Beaches involved in the scene, like for Massapil and Hellmen, all those guys. That was where they were from. Well, not all of them, but, you know, some of those guys at least were, like Massapil, half of them were from like out west, you know, but some of them, but the, you know, two of the other guys were from the beaches. So, and even Massapil, when you look at it, there was a connection to the Rocks, even, like, because like the drummer, you know, original drummer for Massapil did play in the Rocks before that. So there's kind of all these connections all through it, you know, with people moving between different bands and the way things sort of flowed on. So I think, I know there's someone else I've missed out. Actually, yeah, I guess Persecution, like before I joined them, you know, they were a band I used to see, and I liked them, you know, and I remember seeing them at punks picnics and stuff. And I remember seeing them support To Departsy, and I remember they were kind of, you know, they were kind of bringing in a bit more of a metal sort of influence into things, and you know, but they all still sort of fitted into the punk scene as well. So there was kind of like that crossover kind of happening, and I thought it was kind of interesting, you know, that they could play like a Venom cover but do it in a real kind of heavy kind of like punk crust kind of way, and people, you know, probably didn't even realise it was a Venom cover, but you know, they were kind of mixing it up, and I thought that was kind of interesting at the time, you know. So yeah, just talking about the venues that were around, you know, like Terrible Virtue, like our first gig we played was at Burland Community Hall, in Newtown, and like, you know, there's a lot of the punk scene was based around Newtown at the time. You know, you had like pubs that people would hang out with, like the Oxford on King Street, which is now Zanzibar, and, you know, and looks totally different. But yeah, it was at that point, like, you know, it was like a punk pub, you know, and some of the people who worked behind the bar were punks, and then there was a jukebox in the corner that people used to drink. The punks used to drink there. You know, they put the CDs into the jukebox. You know, the owner didn't care as long as, you know, people were there drinking, and it was, you know, that was a place people could go and hang out and feel comfortable, you know. And then there was the Townie, which was kind of much sort of smaller scale than it is now, but that was kind of another pub that people would hang out and drink. It didn't have bands, but people could hang out there. There was the Sando, you know, and that was kind of like, looked quite different to it does now, but, you know, inside at least it had a small kind of circular bar, kind of like the same as the Townie did at that point. But I don't really ever remember the Sando as being somewhere where a lot of punk bands played, but like I did see some bands play there and people would go there a bit, but it wasn't really that much of a venue at the time for the sort of bands that I was seeing anyway. I mean, there was some bands that definitely played there, but it wasn't like a regular thing. I don't think it was, you know, it was more sort of rock and roll bands or indie bands or whatever. It was more, you know, than just, yeah, it wasn't really that much of a punk sort of pub. But then I guess people were playing all sorts of places, you know, even like, you know, To The Party would play places like, you know, Randwick Racecourse. You know, people just play wherever they could, you know, and you'd kind of travel to see gigs as well. You know, you'd go down to Sutherland Royal and see a gig there if there was a gig on there, you know, or you'd go to Penshurst Den and see a gig there if there was a gig there. It was just like wherever the gigs were, you know, people would travel a bit more. I mean, I remember going to see the gig at like Wollongong Workers Club one night. Everyone went down there. There was a gig on down there, you know, in the late 80s, and turned into a total bloodbath. But there was some, again, some skinhead violence, and I just remember a table covered in blood, and like, yeah, skinheads taking over the stage and taking over the gig. I remember after the gig, sort of like hiding in some house we found that we're going to try and stay in overnight until the train came in the morning, and just skinheads outside trying to smash the windows in and shit, and just like, yeah, just not good. But yeah, that sort of shit happened, you know. But yeah, there was stuff like that where you just travel, you just go to wherever the gigs were, you know. I guess there was just less to pick from, you know. There'd be a gigs on and you'd go to them wherever they were, you know. It just wasn't as much to pick from, you know. There's not as many options, you know. If you were into it, you'd do whatever, you know, to go and see stuff. But yeah, and I guess gentrification comes into how things change as well. Like, as far as like Newtown, you know, it's I mean, 20 years on, you know, of course, you know, it's not affordable to live there like it once was, and so like the punk scene's kind of moved from there, you know, and there's more happening now in like warehouses in Marrickville and stuff like that, because it's more affordable, you know. Things have moved a bit more west, you know. You know, it's just gentrification. What's happened? I mean, it was what happened. Like, you know, the earlier punk scene before the period we're talking about now was all based more around Darlinghurst and stuff, you know, and like that's, you know, and Surrey Hills and that, you know, even by the time I moved into Cleveland Street in Redfern, like in 1990, there wasn't anything around there then. Even, you know, there was no venues around there. There was some people living around there still. You know, I remember some of the guys from the Splatterheads lived next door to me, and I remember like Jody from Blind Ambition lived down the road, and some of those guys, and there was, you know, one of the guys from the Space Juniors lived across the road. So there was people around who kind of were involved in bands and punk bands and stuff, but there wasn't really anywhere you'd hang out around there and drink, or there was no venues, you know. You still would have to go to other places to see bands. So things had moved on even at that point. And then they moved to Newtown, and then from Newtown it's kind of like, well, there is, you know, these days there is the Sando, and there is some places you can play, and going back a bit, I guess in the mid-90s you had like Feedback above Newtown Station, so that was kind of like a bit of a regular punk sort of venue. Then you did have some all ages kind of gigs happening, you know, Berlin Hall that I mentioned, but then after that, a bit later on, you know, you had Newtown Neighbourhood Centre opposite the Newtown Station that had people could put on gigs there too, and there was definitely like hardcore gigs and punk gigs that happened there and stuff, and some that I put on, but other ones that happened as well. So there was definitely, and there was the punk picnics happening as well, you know, down in Sydney Park, St Peters. But yeah, I guess things have just changed, you know, and it always changes with gentrification. The you know, where the venues are and where the people live who play in bands is always going to change, you know. So yeah, that's where it's at. Well, finding out about, you know, records and about new bands was kind of, you know, obviously a bit harder than it is now. So I remember mostly it was like people just swapping music with each other, you know, tape trading, that kind of thing, or people, you know, someone going, hey, you go check out this band, you know, I'll make a tape for you, you know, making, you know, mixtapes, that kind of stuff. That stuff was definitely going on. Or someone's older brother had some record and, you know, they'd lend it to you or whatever, or they'd, you know, anyway, that kind of stuff would happen. And that happened at school, you know, and a couple of the guys from Treble Virtue I was at school with, and we were kind of swapping stuff. And, you know, so we put each other onto different things. And then there was, even like, yeah, when we were living down in the southern suburbs, there was like, we heard about, you know, the anarchist bookstore, you know, Black Rose in Redfern. So someone put us onto that, and so we ended up, we'd catch the train into there, and, you know, and we'd be shitting ourselves a little bit because Redfern was pretty rough at the time, and we'd be like, fuck it, we'll make the dash from the station to the, you know, the bookstore, and once we get in there, we'll be right. And we'd get in there, and then they had all, you know, and they'd stock really cheap records, and it was all the English stuff that was coming out at the time, you know, all the stuff that was coming out on Crash Records and other labels as well. It was even like early Earache stuff and Peaceville and all these kind of labels. So we were hearing all that early kind of English stuff. Well, not early English, but the English stuff that was coming out at the time, like in the late 80s, you know. So you had all your kind of, you know, your bands like Heresy and Concrete Socks, and then you had Conflict, and you had Subhumans and all these kind of bands. And they also stopped like some Discord stuff as well. So we're picking up records by American bands, you know. At that point, some of this stuff was kind of old, really, when I think about it now, like Minor Threat records and things like that. But it was like we were kind of like just catching up, really, in a way, and we'd swap all these records between us, and we're getting influenced by all that stuff at the same time. I mean, I guess there was early Napalm Death, things like that were kind of like, wow, you know, super fast, you know, the fastest stuff we'd ever heard. So that kind of influenced bands, and especially like, say, Treble Virtue, the band I was in, to try and play as fast as we could, because we heard, you know, Napalm Death and Extreme Noise Terror and stuff like that at that time. We went, fuck, we want to play fast like these guys too, you know. So that kind of, you know, really had an influence. But and I guess, and the other record stores around the time were like Phantom and Waterfront, you know, and going to those stores for the first times were like a big deal for me, you know. It was like, you know, someone would go, oh, you go to Waterfront, it's blah blah blah, and you'd make the trek to the city, you know, from the suburbs, and you'd be like, wow, all these records, you know, and all this stuff, you wouldn't know where to start, you know. And you'd even be asking the guys at the store for recommendations and stuff, or just reading whatever that was written on the notes on the front of the record, that they'd give you a kind of a bit of a blurb about what the record was, or, you know, you were really just like starting from scratch in a way. You didn't really know what you're getting to. You just buy records and take a chance half the time and go, oh, fuck, that's great, or that's rubbish, or whatever. So yeah, it's kind of that's kind of where it was at. And there was some sort of, also, like, I remember Brett Crotter from Massiville had like a bit of a mail order list, and he would hand out at gigs and stuff, and he was importing all this kind of you know, pretty obscure European stuff and that, you know, and he had records by Negazioni and bands like that, and tapes and records and things, and that was another way you could kind of pick up things here and there. But yeah, you had to really dig hard to find things, you know. And even finding out about what other bands you might like would be kind of like just scouring, you know, the inner sleeve of a record and seeing what bands they thanked, and you go, oh fuck, these guys like that band, so maybe I'd like that band too. So, you know, that was a way that a lot of people did it. And there was also, you know, stuff like, I guess, some Maximum Rock and Roll was pretty influential at the time too, and we could pick up copies of that real cheap at the Black Rose bookstore. They stocked that, and that was like, you know, it was full of reviews and interviews with like the bands at the time, you know. So that was another way we'd pick up on stuff and go, oh, that review, you know, read a review of something that sounded like you'd like it, you'd try and track it down, or maybe you'd write to them and order it, or that kind of stuff. So that was definitely way you heard about things. And there was more trading as well, you know, like people would write letters to you. If you're in a band, they'd write to you and you'd write to them, and then there'd be kind of, you know, you'd trade records, or you'd put them onto other bands that, you know, that they might like from Australia, and then vice versa. You know, that kind of stuff would definitely happen, you know, probably more so than it does now, you know.